The Greater Centerville Historians organized in the year 2000. The purpose of the organization is to preserve the history of the Township of Centerville, Cleveland and surrounding area. Gerald O'Neill, Charlie Bauer, Richard Wiegand, and myself, Kathleen Sicily, were the founding members. In 1831, the territory south of Green Bay was sold to the U.S. government by the Native Americans who had title to the land. The consideration was the promise of a reservation in another state. The Township of Centerville was established in 1850. The township had a village called Centerville. The reason for the hamlet's original name of Centerville was, in the days of the Indians, there was a trail along Lake Michigan between Manitowoc and Sheboygan. This heavenly spot was exactly at the halfway mark, so the early white man gave it the name Centerville. In 1849, the village of Centerville was surveyed and laid out in lots and blocks. The village of Centerville was renamed Hika when the Postmaster General informed the village leaders that another Centerville was located in the state. When it became time for Centerville to be renamed, a judge in Manitowoc by the name of Albert Schmidt would take kids hiking. The judge said, "You can't call a town hiking, so why not make it Hika?" Thus the village of Centerville became Hika. In the early years, Centerville had the vision of becoming a lake port. To encourage ships to dock there, 2 piers were built into Lake Michigan. Many German immigrants arrived by schooners, and the village began to grow. The village had a brick factory, stores, schools, a Lutheran and a Catholic church, mills, saloons, blacksmith shop, and a fire department, and a brewery. When the brewery was built, the settlement began to flourish. But when fire destroyed the brewery, the largest industry, there was no longer a need for the harbor facilities. So ended this chapter of the development of Hika. 2 miles west of Hika, another settlement known as St. Wendel began to grow. It had a Catholic church, a general store with a connected dance hall, and a post office was also located in the complex, a funeral parlor, and at one time a motel. With the clearing of the forest, tilling of the land began. This prompted the exporting of lumber and grains. The farmers of Centerville looked forward to the building of a railway since they had a serious problem transporting their products. In 1873, the Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western Railroad was built between the settlements of Hika and St. Wendel and was named Centerville Station. In 1880, Centerville Station was renamed Cleveland after President Grover Cleveland. Cleveland, at that point in time, owes its growth to the fact that the Township of Centerville was a rich farming community, and farmers for miles around would bring products to be shipped by rail or ship. The village of Cleveland had several grocery stores, a furniture store, a funeral parlor, several saloons, Lutheran church, hardware stores, several gas stations, newspaper, photographer studio, several car dealerships, cheese factory, several feed mills, livestock yard, and lumber yards. The biggest business was the Cleveland Co-op, which offered many types of services. With the failing of grain crops, the farmers began dairy farming. With the abundance of milk, another industry began, cheese and butter making. Local cheese factories dotted the countryside. One-room schools were usually built near the cheese factories, so children would have a ride to school when farmers brought their milk. In 1958, Hika, St. Wendel, and Cleveland incorporated into the village of Cleveland. In 1968, the Cleveland Elementary School was built. The Township of Centerville has seen many farming changes, but dairy farming is still the primary vocation. Today, Cleveland is known as the seat of Lakeshore Technical College, which offers an educational alternative to 4-year colleges. An ancient proverb states, When an old person dies, a library burns to the ground. These words were the inspiration for organizing the Greater Centerville Historians. We hope to preserve as many memories as possible.
Some other stuff and kind of work on it first back. And then we break at 7:30 for 5 minutes. And then we go to 8:30. But if you don't have enough material, don't worry about it. We always got enough to cover or whatever, you know. Card from Kathy, and they had to point it out to me because I didn't realize that she actually put it on the card that we had a broad fry coming up. But these are the pictures from the broad fry down at the mobile station. And I was hoping you could read the gasoline prices here, but last year when we had it, the gas price was $3.94, and this year was $2.49. So that made a big difference in the speed that we could sell out of our hamburgers. So the ladies in there took care of the selling them. The two guys in the red apron took the part of frying it, and they got 2 more pictures that I'm going to put up. I'll just put the one up, and then I'll pass them around. And like I said, I got a couple extra ones here and I'm just going to pass them around. And the other thing I got here, and I'm gonna go back in the outside room so I can read it, but some of you that know Jim Smith, and I work on another committee with him on history stuff, and he was down at the Manitowoc County Historical Society, and he found this that refers to town 17. And that is the town of Cleveland. And this is a petition to the County Board of Supervisors to form the town of Cleveland. And I'm going to try to read it and then I'm going to pass it around. But if you follow it up here, this is Manitowoc County, town 17, range 23, which would be Cleveland. And it says here, we, the undersigned citizens of, I think it's said town, do hereby petition to the county of, and this word is split, it should be supervisors, to set the town of 17, and this is of, and that's not proper English, of from all other towns, and also fix upon a place to hold our first annual town meeting. Now this particular petition was not acted upon, and there's a list of names here, and I got one other sheet that I'm going to put up, and I only recognize 3 names on there. And I want to know if anybody else in this group would recognize some of the older names. And it's hard to read, but this is August Taple, Carl Wiegand, and Lutzy.
Gottlieb, yeah, there was a Gottlieb Lutz.
Gottlieb Lutz. And the rest of them, well, you know, I can't read script anyhow. It's pretty tough to read.
Yaney on the bottom.
There's a Yaney in the bottom?
Oh, Yaney, yeah.
I'm going to pass this around, so as the night goes on, just take a look at it. And then I would like you people to identify the names so we can write them down so they're legible.
Charlie, this is for the
3. So this was the original, actually this is not the original, this is a copy of the original petition to the County of Supervisors to form this township. And it would be nice to know the names, and there's quite a few names on this thing, it really surprised me.
What year was that?
It was before 1850. And they couldn't tell me the exact date, but if you look at this, the size of the document wasn't very big.
Not 18 pages.
Just a little square thing up here, and up there in the script it does say petition for the town of Centerville, but there's some scribbling on there. It's probably a date, but we couldn't make it out. So I'm going to pass this all around, and if you know, just put a little pencil mark by the name, and then later on tonight we can get to that.
Tom Price's mother-in-law left her home. They went through the papers, and she lived on the other side of the Two Rivers near Francis Creek. They came across this slip, a receipt from Pytel's store, and it says 6 gallon of gas. Did they have a gas pump?
No.
No? What kind of gas would have they had?
Maybe just carrots.
You know that it would have said 6 gallons gas, $2.
It's isn't it a GO or something like that?
No?
$2 worth of goods?
Huh?
Goods?
Or goods? That's abbreviation.
Groceries.
Abbreviations, maybe 6?
Or groceries?
Groceries?
Groceries, yeah.
But I thought it was interesting, right? And then we have another photo to identify, but I think it has, you recognize it? On that side of the room?
You can't see it from this side of the room.
You can't see it? Oh, we'll put it up again after a while then. Evidently it's Cleveland.
The Miller's Tavern.
Yep, that's Miller's Tavern. And Stoltenberg Store is next.
Place from any which way.
So,
They should-
what are the buildings in the back? Was that furniture store that Stoltenberg's had?
Well, that was the store before it burned down.
Yeah, but what are all those other big buildings?
Was it at the barns?
The what?
Barns?
There used to
The
be
A
barns?
horse barn.
horse barn back
Oh.
there.
They did that training of horses.
Maybe, huh? And St. Wendel's church is way on the top.
What street is that on, please?
Miller's-
Hickory
it's the
Street.
same today.
Hickory Street? Okay.
Yeah.
What's these? It's still the same portion and everything.
By yourself, please. Right
Fred
ahead.
Jacoby.
Yes.
All right, well, there are barns, a couple of barns there. I see about 3 at least.
Okay.
And likely they were, like, most of them were, maybe all of them gone by the time I was growing up. Because this was the empty corner to the left of this front main building here. The way I look at it, that was where the bank was built then.
Oh,
And I think that was around 1909, right?
See, that's what I don't know.
Yeah, 11, somewhere's in there, that's when that was built.
But, you know, people wanted to build houses, so barns probably got torn down.
And it's got some log houses up, a log building up there too.
thank you.
But what would
Thing, I also got the Schmidt's directory from Manitowoc County, 1899 to 1900, and I just copied the pages that refer to St. Wendel, Cleveland, and Hika. So there's names on here, and it also tells the business that we're in case that would help you to identify some of the names. I'll just pass that around. And Jerry would like everyone to stand, and we're going to do the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, and then we're going to go into our regular introductions, and then we'll have Vern give us a little talk. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We can be seated.
Okay, we have a young lady here this evening, and she's going to start us off with our July meeting, I guess, and she'll identify herself, and we'll go for introductions.
Good evening, everybody. It's so nice to see everybody, and I want to thank everybody that supported our broth fry. It was a success. We sold out at about 2 o'clock, right? We were done, and then we had to clean up. And we took $500 and some in, and now I had to pay Charlie $200 for getting the brats and the buns. So, but thank you very much, and I also want to thank Beatrice O'Neill and Cheryl Bauer for helping, and particularly Charlie and Jerry for the fine job they always do in setting up.
And Irene also.
Oh yes, Irene, my gosh, you know, she takes the money in. She's our money lady, and it's been such a blessing to have her. Yeah, so we don't have many rules. We ask that you raise your hand when you want to say something so Jerry can go over there so we don't miss any of your valuable information, and state full names. So,
okay.
And I guess our guest has just stepped out for a moment.
Yeah, I'll go find it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll go anyway on the intro.
Okay, my name is Kathy Sicily, and it is July the 12th today.
Okay, and
And
where?
it was about 72 degrees, a beautiful day.
Okay, and where are you from?
I'm from Newton, Wisconsin. I live on County Trunk X, going to
Okay.
School Hill.
Thank you. And who do you have here, please?
Janet Miller, Loretto, Wisconsin, or Hika when I'm down here.
Okay, very good. And who do you have here, please?
Leonard Matthias, 1018 Juniper Street, Cleveland.
Thank you.
Alice Matthias, same address.
Okay,
Irene 915 Polk Lane.
thank you.
Joe Kress from the town of Mosel.
Thank you.
Peg Crest from the town of Mosel.
Thank you.
Walter Kress from East Washington,
Good.
Cleveland.
Cleveland, good.
Karen Yeager-Stobe, originally from Sheboygan, now living in Jasper, Indiana.
Oh, thank you.
Darlene Yeager from Sheboygan.
Okay, thank you.
Ellsworth Yeager, Sheboygan.
Thank you.
Dan Stoll from Jasper, Indiana, originally Kiel, Wisconsin.
Okay, thank you.
Paul Jacoby from Cleveland.
Thank you.
Dan Schmidt, Elkhart Lake.
Thank you very much.
Naomi Schmidt, Elkhart Lake.
Thank you also.
Selma Vogel, Cleveland. You got to talk into there. Selma Vogel, Cleveland. You get it? Edith, let's see, Cleveland.
Thank you.
Audrey Ertl, St. Nazians, and I hate to correct Kathy, but I think it's the 13th of July. She said the 12th.
There you go. Thank you.
Rick Beiersdorf, maybe.
Thank you.
Carl Ziegler, County Trunk XX, Mimi.
Good. Thank you.
Marie Volan, town of Sheboygan.
Thank you.
Frederick Jacoby, Manitowoc, but I have a comment about the date. On that side of the room, it's the 12th, but on this side, it's the 13th.
Okay.
So I never knew this, but it's probably the international date line.
That could be the problem.
Alvin Ely, Cleveland.
Thank you.
Jerry Leonard, town of Sheboygan.
Thank you, Jerry.
Victor Schill, Glenbeulah.
Thank you.
Will Balance, Cleveland.
Thank you very much.
John Wiegand, town of Centerville.
Thank you.
Charlie Bauer, town of Newton.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'm gonna have that cameraman.
Okay. Jerry O'Neill, the videographer for the evening, and we have a guest here, and he'd like to introduce himself also.
Vern Wernecke from Sheboygan.
Thank you, Vernon. Okay, we got a gentleman here who's going to provide a lot of information this evening, and he'd like to start out by reading something perhaps. Go right ahead, please.
I was born in the 25th of December, 1975.
You're still young.
You're young.
1916, which makes me 92 years old now.
Okay.
I was born a half a mile south of Stock's Dinner Club on the Wernecke homestead. That was my grandfather Wernecke's farm. My dad had just bought it bought part of it years previously. I graduated from Manitowoc High School 1933 at age 16. There were no jobs available due to the Great Depression. So I worked for my mother's parents on the farm for a year. Then the daughter of a family living close to us came over to see my parents and said she knew of a job if they wanted to take me there so that people could talk to me, because she was a maid for a Chicago family at Elkhart Lake. And this family was the Arthur Robb family from Sheboygan. They had a cottage for that summer right next to these people who were their relatives. Mr. Robb had multiple sclerosis. And when Mother and Dad and I went in there, I wasn't full grown yet then. I was about 3-4 inches shorter than I am now, and I was lucky if I weighed 140 pounds. So he took one look at me and he says, "That boy can't handle me." And my dad wanted to be sure that I would get a job so I could bring a paycheck home. And he said he's worked on the farm all his life, he's strong. Well, Mr. Robb says, "Come on over here and see if you can get me out of my chair into my wheelchair." So he showed me how to take a hold of him, and it was a struggle, but I got him on his feet. I got him turned around, I put him in his wheelchair, Well, he says, now put me back into where I was. So I did that. And he looked at my mother and dad and said, well, we'll try him out for a week. If he doesn't work out, then we'll call you and you can take him home again. Now, they were a very nice family to work for. The job description was really houseman and chauffeur. Like the Rice and the Walrus and all those families had somebody that did that. But they needed primarily for me to take care of Mr. Rob. But I did all the lawn work, and I kept the car clean, and I washed the windows and all those jobs that somebody would do. When the maid washed, I had to carry the clothes out for her and things like that. When it was house cleaning time, I had to beat the rugs and help with that. Now I don't think I mentioned he had multiple sclerosis. That's why he was crippled. I worked there for 7 years. I took him to California 4 winters after the first of the year. His parents had retired out there at Santa Monica, that's on the ocean from Los Angeles. That's where I got to like the West and the national parks out there, because he let me pick the way we wanted to go. We, of course, always went the southern route. We didn't want to go through all the snow in the mountains. In the fall of 1940, when the draft was, I was number 29 on the draft list in Sheboygan. Now, anybody that enlisted, of course, pushed everybody else on the draft list back one. But it doesn't take long, and your number is right up there at the top. Mr. Robb got the draft board to give me 6 months deferment. He knew them, and he called them up and said, hey, you can't take that boy yet, you got to give me a little time to get a replacement. After about 4 months, I noticed that he wasn't trying to get a replacement. He figured he could call the draft board again, and I'd get another replacement. But the way Hitler was going through Europe, I decided I wanted to get in now and get my basic training out of the way and come back at the end of the year if necessary. So my younger brother Donald, he was 60 years younger than I am, was working in a bakery. In those days it was all night work, and he wasn't crazy about it. My parents thought too he would be better off to work for the Robs. So he came in for a couple of weeks, and I showed him how to do everything. And then I realized they didn't have a ramp on that porch. I always carried Mr. Rob up the steps bodily. And so we quick built a ramp for him, because Donald wasn't used to handling him then. On the 7th of July then, or that before the 7th of July, I got my notice then to report. And it must have been one of the first large groups. There were about, something like 30 of us. So we had a meet down at the old post office on 8th Street. And we followed a drum and bugle corps down to the railroad station, and we went down to Milwaukee in the evening. They put us in a hotel overnight, took us over to one of the theaters, and we could watch the show they had there. And then the next morning they took us back, and by noon all of us had been examined, and they said they would call a few back for a second exam. Well, I was one of them they called back, and I thought, now what? Well, here I went to all of this trouble to get here, and you want to send me back home. Well, it turned out that evidently they found something wrong on the x-ray of my chest, because they took another x-ray, and then they said, no, you're okay. Then, after you were examined, the whole group got on the train, and we took the train down to south of Beloit and Rockford. There was a camp there which was called a reception center. All fellows went to a reception center after they had their examination. Now that was called Camp Grant. And we were all tired, but they had a big steak dinner all ready for us. So we had that, and then they showed us how to make our cots in the beds, and we crawled in. Well, I was dead tired, and 10 minutes later, somebody was shaking me. And he says, "Get up." I said, "I just got to bed. What do you mean, get up?" "Oh, no," he says. "It's 5:30. We get up here at 5:30. You've been sleeping all that time." Then they showed us again how to make the beds. And after a few tries, if you didn't know how to do it, they tear the sheets and blankets off again, throw them on the floor, and you start it all over again. Until you had that blanket and sheet so tight that if you dropped the 50-cent piece on it, it bounced up.
Pardon me, would you mind sitting? You could sit down, you don't have to stand though, or you want to stand?
No, I prefer to sit.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I thought you preferred me to stand.
There. Sit down and I'll push you ahead.
Thank you, Willard.
Thank you for your comment.
Can you all hear all right?
Yeah, you're doing fine.
Oh, okay. Now, some were sent out already in 2 or 3 days to some other camp for their basic training. Most of us were there for, 5, 6 to 10 days. And the first weekend they said, well, if anybody wants a pass, they can go home. They said, hitchhiking is pretty good. So they gave us a few hints. Don't let somebody take you out of town for 10 miles and then you stand there and try to get another ride. He says, be sure if you get a ride with somebody that they're going to another town. So I hitched home that weekend, and I was home in about 3 hours. And people were very nice. They would go out of their way to take you an extra couple of miles. But that was the only weekend that I was able to get home.
Were you in uniform already?
Yeah, after at the reception center, that's one of the first things we got was our uniforms. And of course you got all your shots and all those things. Then there were about 50 of us were sent to Camp Lee, Virginia, which is south of Richmond. And the closest large town to it was Petersburg. Now, when the draft was in Congress, the country was quite isolationist yet, so it barely passed. The Army was the only ones that needed draftees. The other services all got plenty of recruits. They didn't want to get into the Army and have to walk 30 miles a day. When we got to Fort Bragg, they were still working on some of the barracks and building different buildings there, but we had about 140 or so in our company, and they were in 4 different barracks. They give us all kinds of training in what a nurse would have to do, all the different kind of bandages you need if somebody has a broken arm or a broken leg or is wounded and all those things. And because it was kind of hot there and some of the boys weren't that interested in it, they'd fall asleep. One day we got a regular Army officer in to talk to us. And after those guys got to sleep, he raised his voice and said, "You better listen to what we have to say when we train you here. You aren't all going to be working in a hospital. With every company of infantry, there are 2 medics. And you are going to have to take care of those boys when they get hurt any time." And that was an eye-opener for most of us. because we had no idea that the medics went right over the, when the infantry got out of their foxholes and started to attack, that you followed them right along. I was there for 13 weeks of training. And then pretty soon 2 different groups were sent to different camps, and all of a sudden about 50 of us were told to be ready tomorrow morning. And we got sent to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. They already had 2 large hospitals there. They were working on a 3rd one, and were going to build a bigger one yet, because they would be getting a lot of the wounded that would be coming from the European theater, plus other hospitals all up and down the coast. They didn't give me anything to do for a couple of days, and finally I wanted to send my laundry out, and my name wasn't on the list yet, so I went in to see somebody and I said, I want to send my laundry out, but my name isn't on the list. And so he went and checked. Oh, yeah, somebody must have forgot about you. So then they put me on a surgical ward, and we were called ward boys. There was a nurse there that took care of all the patients, and we were the ward boys, and we did all the things that she needed help with. Well, I soon found out I wasn't a ward boy, I was a bedpan mechanic. That's what they called us. And of course, you know, you get a bunch of youngsters together, you always got some humor with that. So I worked on that regular surgical ward until they had maneuvers down in Louisiana. And when all the troops that, not all the troops from Fort Bragg went down there, but there were quite a few went down there. They were gone for about a month on maneuvers, and when they came back, because a lot of them had hemorrhoids from sitting on those hard seats in the trucks. So the nurse told me, Vernon, you're going to have to shave all of them before we work on their hemorrhoids. So I learned how to shave bungholes. And there was very few of them that didn't holler, hey, get a decent razor blade. After about, I think 3 months, then I was put in charge of a venereal ward. Now that had a nurse only to give out medications 3 times a day. The doctor came in and checked them over, and then he gave me the orders to write on what treatment they were supposed to get, and I had to take them to the treatment room to be sure that they got there and got their treatment, not that they didn't goof off. I was on there for about roughly 2 months. Then I was transferred as dispatcher in the truck department. There we were in charge of all the trucks that were used at the hospitals, all the ambulances, nice Cadillac limousine for the general in charge. I was sent as the dispatcher to the transportation office. I had to keep a lot of records of the trucks and ambulances and things like that. A lot of times when there was nobody around and an ambulance had to go out, I went along with them. If the sergeant in charge of the office was there, he'd often send me along. Once in a while we went as far as 40, 50 miles to pick somebody up that was hurt, because that was a very large camp. It was an artillery camp. And after I was there a few months, they started to bring in paratroops and things like that. And they had a big airport then for their training. About, let's see, in the fall of 1942, that was after the war broke out, all of a sudden, 3 of us in the medical detachment were told at 1 o'clock we report to post headquarters. And we asked what's for. Said, I don't know, that's your orders, you report at post headquarters. So the 3 of us went up there and we sat out in the hall, and then all of a sudden the sergeant comes out and he says, we have 60,000 troops here, and they want to pick one person out of medical detachment who has a working knowledge of German. So I want you each to translate a sentence I'm going to give you. Well, I could tell that he knew German at all. How was he going to tell? But the other 2 fellows really stumbled around because they didn't have any much German for years, I guess. And I had no trouble translating that. So he says, okay, Wernecke, you're the man. I says, well, what comes next? Well, you go back and get to work, and in a couple of days you'll get your orders. In a couple of days, I was called in and said, have all your stuff packed in your barracks bag, and then come into the office and we'll have your orders, and we'll have a ticket for the train and some ration money. So the next day I went in, and by that time I knew all the ambulance drivers and things like that. So I just walked out to the gate and had one of them take me into town instead of waiting for a bus or something like that. When I saw my orders, it said Calverton, Virginia. And I thought, now where is that and what is there? There's no camp or anything listed. Well, I had a ticket for Washington, D.C., and there I had a change, a train the next morning at 8 o'clock for Calverton. When I got there, there was no camp around, there was nobody there to pick me up or anything like that. But there were some fellows that worked on the railroad that were eating their lunch there. And they called me, come on over here. I said, are you hungry? Yeah, I said, okay, we'll give you a sandwich. Where are you supposed to go? Oh, I'm supposed to go to a place that's called Windhill Farms Station. Oh yeah, that's just up the road here. He said, we'll take you up there. So it was about 3 miles out of town, and they took me up there and told me, just go in there and report at such and such a building. So I went in there and they checked my papers and everything else, and they had somebody take me a mile back into the woods where there were some barracks, and assigned me to a cot and that, and said, well, the mess hall is a mile back where you just came from, so when it's time to eat, you come down there. So pretty soon they had me all set up there, and they gave us some lectures the next day and said we were going to be code breakers. It was top secret. We were supposed to keep our mouths shut from then on. You don't talk about your work, you don't write your parents about it or anything like that. Otherwise we'll teach you code breaking. So we had close order drill just like we had otherwise for exercise and things like that. And because there were a lot of the barracks not finished yet, some of them didn't have beds in or cots or anything like that. We had help a lot with doing that. We would have classes for a couple of days. Most of the classes were in studying German, and the others were learning how to break codes, all the different kinds that there were. After about 3 months, they picked 3 out of our group, and they said, pack your bags, you're going to leave tomorrow morning. Well, we were pretty sure that meant that they were going overseas then. And sure, they were gone. And about a month later, I and 2 other fellows were given the same orders. Pack your bags and be out here tomorrow. So when we got out the next morning, they had a vehicle for us, and they took us into Washington, D.C., and we were put on a train for Fort Hamilton, New York. Well, we figured that we were going overseas too then. So when we got to Fort Hamilton, they showed us where our cot was and showed us around and things like that. And all of a sudden, those three fellows that had left the month before showed up. We said, "What are you guys doing here?" "Don't tell anybody. They lost us. We've had nobody tell us what to do or anything like that. We go to eat at the mess hall. We go down to downtown New York at night. We get free tickets for all different things. So when they finally find where we are, we're just going to tell them, well, we were waiting all this time for you guys to tell us what we were supposed to do." So we three soon boarded a boat. We happened to be on an ocean liner. It was all full of troops. Every room, the ballrooms, the dining rooms, everything was with the cots 4 high all the way through. But because we were a small group, and there were some other fellows that were in a small group, we got one of the staterooms, so we had our own bathroom, which was like pretty much of a break. Eating was done all day long. You were told when, at what time you were supposed to come to the mess hall. You got in line there, and they only were feeding about 100 fellows at a time. But you were in and out of there pretty fast. They always gave us a good big slice of bread, and we only got 2 meals a day. But I always saved my bread because I had some Limburger along that Mother had sent me before I got there. And there was another fellow that was German that loved Limburger. So one night we got out that Limburger, we started eating. All of a sudden, some of the other fellows says, "What is that smell in here?" "Oh, it's that Limburger cheese." "The way that smells, you better eat it in the bathroom." So they made us go to the bathroom when we wanted to eat the Limburger. We had a 10-day voyage overseas. Most of the rest of the boats were cargo boats. We had a couple of scares when they thought that there might be a submarine close, but they always would drop some depth charges, and that was usually the end of it. When we got to Casablanca, we went to a big camp where all the soldiers went, and there you were sorted out and sent by train or things like that to whatever place you were supposed to go to. And for some reason or other, they must have known that they were waiting for us there, because in a couple of days they said, "Tomorrow morning we take you to the airport and you're going to fly to Algiers." Well, there were only the 3 of us on that plane. That never made any sense to me. There were sure other fellows that they could have taken along. But we got to Algiers, and at the airport they called the 849th Signal Intelligence Service, which was the unit that we were assigned to. And soon they picked us up and took us about 15 miles inland. And here was I would say a nice big hotel. They had hot springs there, and then they had rows of what we call cubicles. It was like smaller than the old-time tourist cabins for some people that couldn't afford the hotel, evidently. And that was where we were. And we got the same lecture again about being top secret and so on. They said, "We're going to take you up to Tunisia where the fighting is going on," so you got in on the tail end of that. And in a couple of days, they filled a 2.5 ton truck with a bunch of stuff that they were sending up there for the fellows that were working there, and our barracks bags and things like that. And it took us a 2 days drive to get up there. We joined a unit which was working with the British to learn how to break codes. the British, of course, had been doing that for over 2 years already. So they showed us all the fine points, and a few days after we got there, then they said, well, now you're on your own. You take the same, we'll give you a copy of all the messages that we work on each day. You try to break them by yourself, and then we'll compare notes at the end of the day. Well, there were 3 fellows that had been with them for a number of months, and they showed us how you break codes. And pretty soon we were doing fairly well because of these fellows showing us all that, and they had learned all the fine points from the British. And we were there for 6 weeks, and then the fighting was over. But just before the fighting was over, well, actually we had radio operators who copied the messages. And they would always, if they had 3 or 4 of them, they would bring them over, or we'd go and pick them up or something like that. And one day, the messages started coming in fast and furious. And most of them were in plain language. And we thought, well, what in the world has happened now? So we asked one of the British what was happening. Oh, he says they're going to surrender now, so they're giving everybody a raise in pay. And that didn't make sense to me either. Who was going to give them a raise in pay? All of a sudden, somebody hollers, "Hey, Wernecke, you're a corporal, you ain't sergeant now." Here there was a German soldier by the name of Wernecke who was on one of those messages, and his name was Wernecke. And I didn't hear anything except that for about 2 weeks. They always wanted to know when I was going to go over by the Germans where I belonged. Oh yeah, I forgot. When we boarded the ocean liner, there was also a Lieutenant Litton sent with us. But because officers were always kept separate, we hadn't seen him until then. And the same way when we were on the plane, he went with us. And I guess I forgot this before. When we arrived there, the first thing they said, "Where were you guys? We've been waiting over a month for you." Well, then we figured out that was those other 2 guys. And I often wondered where I would have ended up at if that hadn't happened. Because I sure wouldn't have gone to that same unit, or not necessarily.
Nothing changes.
Now that would have been the 18th of April of '43. When I arrived at 849 Signal and Intelligence Service. They told us we would be handling all top secret items. We would not use Signal Intelligence Service on our address. It would only be SIS, not Signal Intelligence Service. Going to that, also at Vint Hill Farms, I forgot about that. There were antennas all over the place there, and we couldn't figure out what that was. When we got halfway to Hammamellowan was where that hotel was, 50 miles inland. And on the way, there was a kind of an intersection there with a couple buildings that was all full of antennas too. And we gradually found out that was one of the intercept stations for the German Air Force traffic. And before the end of the fighting there, Hitler was sending, airliners, all full of seats, sending more and more troops in there when they were almost ready to surrender. And the Air Force was so good already that they would intercept those, and they had the code broken right away. They would let the fighter planes know that they were leaving from Sicily at such and such a time, so they were in the air waiting for them. And most of those planes were shot down, and of course all the fellows were killed or drowned. Now, one of the reasons that we were the first detachment to go, it's possible they had some in the Pacific theater already, but in the European theater not, was because after World War I, there was somebody was Secretary of State, and he found out that we were still reading all these messages from other countries, and he went to the president and said, "Gentlemen, do not read each other's mail." And the president listened to him, and they broke up all the code breakers. But there were a few that kept on their own, and they always had somebody that they were working with, and the Navy very much kept most of them. But they put them way back in some building where nobody knew where they were, and that was the reason that they had so much of the Japanese naval code broken before the war started. Now, the reason they couldn't predict Pearl Harbor was because those boats went on radio silence. So for a couple weeks before they even left Japan, they didn't hear anything from them. And they assumed that they were going south with a lot of other ships that had been going along the coast of China to the Mid-East, where they figured they were going to take over the oil fields from the Dutch that had oil fields down there. And that's why they were able to surprise us that way. But we got back at them later through the same thing. When they found out that the Japanese were going to try to capture Wake Island and some of those islands, they decided to lay a trap for them, because they were using some kind of code for all the different islands. And they were the code breakers were pretty sure that the island they were going to was Wake. So they sent a message to the Wake that they should send a message back to them that they were almost out of water and they needed water right away. So Wake sent it in clear language, not in code, just we need water, so send some as soon as you can. Well, the Japs sent another message after that, and that had that same code in there again, so they knew it was Wake Island, and our Navy and the aircraft carriers and that went there, and in a couple of days they sank 3 of the Japanese aircraft carriers then. And that put quite a dent in then, so we got back at them there. That was our Pearl Harbor to them. Now, after we were finished in Tunisia, we went back to Algiers at Melouan. We didn't know where we were going next. And all of a sudden, one day, a group of 50 from Mint Hill Farms arrived. A lot of them that I knew that had been there, and they were being sent over because they were going to form new groups. And another smaller group arrived a few days later. Then we were allowed to write home that we were in Africa. So I could write my parents that we were in Africa. I tried to send it through a little code too, but they didn't catch on. I told them they should check with my brother that I had met his friend Casa from Casablanca, but that didn't make any sense to him. Now, we were going to be going somewhere soon, and they broke up might say they just split the code breaking group and the radio operators and whoever, the cooks and all that. And they made 2 units out of us, and we got new men to fill out, so we had 2 units. So they needed extra drivers, so they taught me how to drive a weapons carrier and put me on a big truck, and we had to take a wire cable and pull us out of the ditch and things like that. Then we got a crash course in driving at night in blackout. Well, that I didn't like. They had real tiny lights on the back, and you had to keep close enough to see those tiny lights. If they looked like they were going out, you were too far back. If they looked brighter, then you had to slow up a little bit. We had been with 128th Signal Company. When it was split up, we were put in the new 127th. On June 17th, 43, we left in a convoy of 13 vehicles for a 2-day trip to Bizerti up in Tunisia, where the fighting had ended. I found before I was moved there, I had been a corporal when I went overseas. I was at the next promotion to a T3. The harbor of Bizerti was full of boats that they were loading, and we had our first air raid there. Well, they were going for the harbor, so they didn't bother us any. But they came over. The first plane had flares so bright it was almost brighter than daylight outside. And then the plane started to come over. Well, they had some searchlights there, and they got a couple of them in the searchlights, but a single searchlight has a hard time keeping track of them. And every so often, 2 searchlights would come together, and they'd have the plane right in the 2 searchlights. And then when the anti-aircraft guns really could fire the way they should. The invasion of Sicily took place on July 11th. And we had, I think, 3 or 4 times we were sent from you were always sent first to a staging area. And then you were not allowed to leave that staging area for anything. Because when your group went on the boat, you had to be there to get on the boat. We went down to the beach 4 different times. And each time we were turned around and sent back. The last time we went on, 10 of our trucks got on, and then they pulled us off again. But the 5th time, that was the lucky time we got on. Well, we finally found out later in Sicily, Patton was the commander there, and he didn't think he needed anybody telling him what the Germans were going to do. He could take care of that himself. That was one of the reasons we were always taken off and somebody else was put on. But he learned his lesson too after they broke out of the beachhead cross-channel invasion. I'll tell you about that later. By the next evening, we were on the north coast of Sicily. The invasion had been on the south coast. And Patton's Armored Division and the 3rd Infantry Division, which was one of the best infantry divisions we had. It was commanded by General Lucien Truscott. And he trained his people in Africa already until they could march 30 miles a day with a full pack, their rifle, and whatever else they had to carry. Anybody that couldn't make it was sent to some other unit, and they got new men in.
And of course, it was going to be a little bit of a race who got to the northern port of Palermo, the Armored Division or the Infantry Division, because they had to fight their way there. Well, the Armored Division had to go on the roads. And there were a lot of roadblocks. There were places where bridges were blown up and stuff like that, so they couldn't move as fast. Whereas the 3rd Infantry Division, they used every road or every path, anything like that. They didn't just march as one long string. And when Patton got to Palermo, here the 3rd Division was there to welcome him to Palermo.
A little of that,
Yeah.
so they understand when I mentioned it in here. Sure, okay. Yeah.
I kept thinking, well, who the heck is that? And then when I saw you here, well, then
Otherwise, I could go.
That was up with
we could. That's where he spends the rest of his time. He couldn't even go out.
Board up here. So we're going to turn the microphone back over to Vern here, and he's going to continue with his little adventure.
This first group here is what they call simple substitution. You write out an alphabet, all 26 letters, and then underneath you mix up the alphabet. So if you send a message and you want to use an A, you use an F instead. It looks like it's such a simple thing, but you'd be surprised how hard once in a while it is to figure it out on those messages, because the message is not all this. Then the other code that we had was called a 3-letter group code. That was all 3 letters. They had what they called the Heeres Signaltafel, or the Army Signal book. That book had 500 of these 3-letter groups on pages down one side, and on the other side the word or group of words that 3-letter group stood for. Now this is one of the best messages we like to get. It had only one 3-letter group, and it had this. Because that was when a German bunch of soldiers, a company or a battalion or something like that would send that message. It usually meant Standort, or our headquarters, and then the town that they were in. Or if they were fighting and they were pushing us back, they would tell where they were, so that they had pushed us back to that town. Only they were retreating most of the time. So we always got where their new headquarters was. Then we could give the Air Force that information, and they could try and see what big building there was that they were occupying and try and bomb them there. This is a much more difficult code. That was used in larger units. We were with a corps. A corps had anywhere from 2 to 5 divisions in it, depending on what the type of fighting they were going to do. An army was with 2 or 3 corps, and this type of code was used in army. I'll have to show you this after a while. I just wanted to get this mixed alphabet and the 3-letter group in, because that's, I'm going to... We had always worked in tents before, but now with winter coming on, they took a 2.5-ton 6x6 army truck, and they fixed up the rear box with a canopy over the top and built some tables along the walls that we could work on. And because it was still warm outside, they put a fan on the front of it to blow air in and out. But because we had to work under blackout conditions at night, we always had to turn that fan off at night, and it was like a Turkish bath in there then. So one of the fellows got the idea of building a box around the fan with only an opening on the bottom where no light could get out. And we turned the fan around to suck the hot air out of the truck, and that really worked quite well. Now, after the invasion of Sicily was over, we stayed in Sicily. We did not go back to headquarters again. We never saw our headquarters again after that. In September 8th, we landed in Italy, but we had a pretty rough going. There were a lot of politics involved there. Italy said they would surrender, and their soldiers would try to fight the Germans with us. Well, there were so many spies in Italy that the Germans knew all about that. So the minute they announced the surrender, the Germans disarmed all the Italian soldiers. And there was a little bit of a mix-up too between some of the generals too. But we got ashore all right, but they had an armored division waiting to counterattack and try and throw us back. And for about 4 or 5 days, it was pretty tough going. They dropped some extra paratroopers in different places. And Montgomery, the British general, was coming up from the toe of the Italy. And they took their sweet time about it. They had no opposition really. All they had to do was come up there, but you know, they got to sit by the side of the road every day and brew tea, and that they didn't get up there in time. And the commanding general of the 3rd Division, he had a little unit like ours. He was intercepting all our messages. He wanted to know how things were going there. When he saw things weren't going very well, he got on a boat, and one of those fast torpedo boats, and he went up there, and before he left, he told his division to get ready to get on the boats as soon as he told them, because he was going to send them in to help. Well, when he got there, he found that it was not quite as bad, and
they would still come there as soon as they could, but it was not a rush. And the Germans, for some reason or other, realized that they weren't going to push us off, so they started to retreat. And pretty soon they were 20 miles down the road. So when we got there a couple of days later, we had no trouble getting on shore and moving inland. We landed at Salerno, we landed near Paestum. That happens to have some old Roman ruins, and some of the fellows in our outfit knew about that. They wanted to go over there, but we didn't have time, so they had to miss that. So we left the beach and went about 15 miles inland, and we set up our radio trucks and antennas and all that. We set up our ice staff truck, and we pretty soon had a very active unit. It was the 103rd Erforschungsabteilung, which is the 103rd Reconnaissance Unit. And we found that they were going all over the front and sending messages from all over. And pretty soon we had our hands full. We couldn't decode them as fast as they came in. And we worked on that for, I would say, 3-4 weeks. And then all of a sudden, we started having trouble. We had a lot of the 3-letter groups already with the correct German behind them. And we'd have a group in a message that absolutely did not fit the word that we had for it. And of course, some of the fellows were pretty sure that they had gotten the correct translation, and others were sure that it was not. It was what they thought it should be. They almost got into a fight over it. And that kept on for any number of days. Most of the messages were okay, but every so often we'd get one that didn't make sense. And all of a sudden we got a call from G2. Now G2 is the Corps Intelligence Office. They've got G1, G2, G3, and G4 for different offices that they have and what they do. They said they wanted our top officer to come down. And he went down there, and they showed him that they had captured a messenger, and he had a strange looking map with him, and they wondered if we were interested in that. Well, the officers looked at it and they said, well, they sure would like to try to figure out what that map was for. And they, of course, questioned the messenger, and through the talking to him, they found out that he had no use for the captain that commanded their unit. So then they really tried to get more information out of him. The officer came back with the map, and we all looked at it, and it seemed to be like one of our civilian maps. In other words, they had their way of, with letters and numbers and things like that on their own maps too, but this had a different sort of system on it to show from right to left or up and down as to where a particular unit was. And we gradually figured out that that's why we couldn't read some of those messages. They were using a different kind of code on the outside to show the locations. And then we all of a sudden realized we had not gotten any Standort messages for some time. We always were wondering, well, why don't they send one of those where they're at? And they used this other map and the kind of messages to send that. Well, we thought they they can still do that. We can maybe figure it out with this map now. But in a couple of days, they had a whole new code. And we had to start from scratch again. And that's always the danger when somebody gets captured with something like that then they change the code. Well, of course, we knew now what type of messages they sent and where they sent them and from what units and things like that. So we right away started getting breaks into the code, and pretty soon we had almost as many words already as we had before. Then it was getting pretty cold already. It was quite mountainous now where we were. There were passes through the mountains, and the Germans had fortified those with concrete pillboxes and all other kinds of like trees cut down and all kinds of piles of stuff that it was hard to go through, and that meant that we would not be able to push them back in winter. And they, of course, didn't attack anymore then, so there we were looking at each other for a while. But you can't really quit fighting in winter either. So our generals made some new plans, and they captured a few of the hills and things like that. And now we were pretty close to the casino. That had a big Catholic monastery on top of it. And the generals all thought the Germans were using that as a lookout for artillery and things like that. Now the Germans insist that they never did. Even after the war, they said they never did. But it had rained so much in fall and was muddy all over that the tanks had to stay on the roads, and then they're a good target for the artillery. And all of a sudden, we got rumors of moving again. We couldn't figure out why. Well, then the rumor came around we were going to be pulled back and we were going to invade Yugoslavia, which was on the east across the part of the Mediterranean. And we wondered what in the world we would be doing there. Well, that was just to throw the Germans off, because all of a sudden we pulled back we went back to Naples, and on the 19th of January, we were ordered to move our vehicles to the Naples Palace grounds next day to waterproof our motors. Well, why did we have to waterproof our motors? Well, we got on some LSTs, that's landing ship for tanks. We put all our trucks and stuff on there, and well, I don't know how many they had. And the first convoy left and came back empty, and then we loaded. And the reason we had to waterproof our motors was because we were going to be landing right off the front of the LST into the water and have to drive ashore. There was a big storm the night that we went up, and it took us 12 hours to get from Naples up about 60 miles north, where we were going to go in behind the German lines at the towns called Anzio and Nettuno. It actually was about 100 miles northwest of Naples and 40 or 50 miles south of Rome, but about another 50 miles where we had to go through all the German blockades and things like that. The top generals, of course, thought that if we got in behind the German line, they would turn tail and retreat to north of Rome. They should have known better. This was the earliest we ever went ashore. We went ashore on the third day after the infantry went in. And we soon found all our vehicles together and got in one spot. And the radio operator started to get messages, and we started to decode the messages. Well, one of the first messages was this Hermann Goering division was coming down from north of Rome. This unit was coming from across on the other side of Italy. And we got more and more messages like that. And fortunately, they were all messages that could be easily broken. They evidently didn't know how good we were. They always thought the Americans couldn't fight. Pretty soon, we started getting air raids, and we moved inland a ways. And this had been a big area of swamp before. And Mussolini had filled all of that in for farming, and then about every what would be our section here, they had about 4 big stone houses. And pretty soon, that's one of the first things that the artillery tries to break up, because that's where you have your headquarters and things like that. So we started to get artillery fire in, and the second day the officers went out and they found us a nice place right behind the woods so that the Germans couldn't see where we were. And we set up our trucks and everything else there, and we stayed there for 4 months. And that was one of the best days or times we had as far as breaking codes and things like that. The Germans brought more troops down to push us off than what we had there. We were trying to get more troops there, but it always took some time. And they had wanted to have us load trucks for more ammunition and food and things like that, and drive them right off of the LST on shore and have empty trucks go on again. Of course, the top commander said, no, we don't do things that way. So for a long time, they had to unload everything by hand onto trucks and then take it in. And the Germans were always attacking the harbor. And they were finally realized that if they didn't do the way that was suggested originally to put trucks on there and drive them right off, they would soon be losing all their boats, because the boats had to stay in the harbor too long. About the 7th of February, the Germans felt they had enough troops to push us off. So they began strong attacks. We had already dug ourselves foxholes and things like that, so we wouldn't get artillery. If we got artillery fire, we wouldn't be hurt. But then they brought a railroad gun down, and that began firing into the harbor. Well, that thing had a range of 20 miles. None of our artillery could reach that. And we'd sit out having our lunch or we'd sit outside having our lunch or supper, and we could hear that gun so far away. You could not barely hear it, but you would hear a loud boom. And by that time, the shell went high and then came down. If they fire so far, that shell has to be in the air quite a while. And right after we heard the boom, we could hear the whoosh, and that was the shell coming down. Well, if you hear a shell, you know it's not going to hit you. The one that hits you, you don't hear. And they were firing always on the harbor. The Air Force tried to bomb them, but they would occasionally get a good hit. But they also had that that railroad gun outside of a tunnel. So when they had fired off a bunch of shots, they would right away move it back into the tunnel. This kept on for most of the time that we were there. Now, as we got more and more air raids and the Germans attacked us, we began to dig in our trucks. We dug a good long trench. We could drive the truck right down in there. We used all the dirt that we had taken out of that hole and put it in sandbags and piled them up on the side of the trucks. On the 15th of October, during this time when they had that heavy attack on, at 5 o'clock in the morning we had a terrific half-hour air raid. And in the morning, when I got up, I saw 2 bombs that hit 100 feet from my foxhole. And there were all our anti-aircraft going off like that. I never heard those bombs hit because that was such a commotion with all the noise with those anti-aircraft guns that I didn't hear that explode. We lost 1 man that night. We lost 1 man that night. If he had been in a foxhole, he would have lived. But he was one of those guys that thought nothing can kill me. So he was a worker in the kitchen, and he got hurt by some of the pieces of that bomb that flew all over. The officer's tent was all full of holes from that bomb, and one of the kitchen tents had a lot of holes in it that they had to get new tents. For some reason or other, we always got messages. We thought that the Germans they usually use the civilian phone lines if they could. But they didn't seem to use them here, so we got a lot of messages. We were busy every day. Then after we stopped that attack, they got more troops down, and they started an attack again about the 16th of February. And this time they did better than the first time. The heaviest attack, by noon they were close enough that we could hear the machine guns in the front lines already. And because we were not supposed to be captured, because they did not want the Germans to know that we were doing this, even though they figured we were doing it, naturally if we had been captured, they would have tortured us until we told them how well we were doing with their messages. So they warned us that if the Germans came any closer, we might have to all burn everything we had there and get on a boat and get back to Naples again. Well, about that time they realized that the top general was not doing his job real well. So General Truscott of the 3rd Division commander, they appointed him assistant corps commander. Well, he found that all the corps generals, they were all in Naples in wine cellars down below the big buildings, so they were safe there. So they told General Truscott there would be a new attack the next morning, and they didn't know if they would last. He's doing a great job of talking about the days of fighting, and he can continue right at this time. Go right ahead, please. They asked General Truscott what he thought they should do. And he said, well, I'm going out and I'm going to check with all the other division commanders
and see how they're doing. So he went right up to the front lines and he talked to all of them. And they said, well, they hoped that they could hold out for a couple more days because they felt the Germans were more tired than our troops were because they were always on the attack. And he went back and told the Corps General that, and he went back to his own division, and the fight continued on for a couple more days. There were some caves where one of the divisions was pushed back far enough that they were in those caves, and they had their machine guns in there, and they kept on firing. They had their other fellows with the handguns and things like that. And there was one place with a creek where the Germans were trying to get across. And some fellow got boxes and boxes of hand grenades, and he stood above that creek all night long. Whenever there was a little noise down there, he'd throw a hand grenade down there. And the next day there was bodies galore. He had kept those fellows from going through there. And that's what it takes when you have fights like that. It takes fellows that have their own initiative and just go ahead and do it. They don't let anything bother them. The next day, we counterattack and pushed the Germans back a ways because they had come into our lines 2 miles. That's why we were hearing machine guns. And after they got that line straightened out, the Germans didn't attack anymore, and we were too weak to attack them. All they did was kind of straighten the lines out to where they were before, and everybody ducked deep foxholes and things like that. And we fired at each other for the next 2 months. The Air Force at that time was not very cooperative. They said all they had to do was bomb the railroad tracks, that they couldn't get any ammunition and stuff down, and pretty soon the Germans would have to surrender. Instead of helping their buddies in the infantry and that. Well, gradually they got a few things straightened out, and we got more air support. And the last time that the Germans, the last attack that they made, there were about 350 of those big 4-motor bombers that went over behind the German lines and bombed where they had tanks and bombed where the infantry were dug in and things like that. And that pretty much stopped their fighting then. Of course, they did a lot of other things yet. They'd move some of their tanks upright with the infantry and fire maybe about 15 rounds and then get away from there again. But General Truscott found a way to stop that too. He had every infantry outfit with one man standing beside there. And they were aiming at one particular place where these tanks always fired from. And the minute the tank would fire, this guy would pull the lanyard and fire the first shell, and by that time the other guys were there to put in more shells. And in about 4 days, you didn't have them come in there anymore because so many of those tanks got destroyed. They were they tried a couple of times at the casino front to break through there, but they weren't successful. So they decided, well, all we can do is wait till spring when it gets dry and the mud is gone. They brought in a number of British troops from their colonies, like we had a division from New Zealand. They had some from the colonies in Africa.
And that's so pretty soon they had a lot of troops down there. We brought a couple divisions over from the States yet. Oh, because we were on the end of the beach yet, you couldn't go to town at night or anything like that. We had to make our own fun. And we had a fellow that started a little newspaper. And just of the news of the different fellows in our company and jokes and things like that. And he was somebody we called Foghead Bergstrom because he always walked around like he was in a fog. And he always talked kind of foolish and that. And we, with the I staff, we would type out 3 or 4 copies of that paper and then we passed it around. Well, then they got the idea. They wanted to set up a bowling alley. So they went out and got sticks of wood that they could, big enough that they could use for that, but then they didn't have a bowling ball. Well, he found a good sized chunk of wood and he was starting to whittle that into a bowling ball. But he got it too close to the fire once, then he got a hole burned in the side. So when you were bowling, there was only one way that you could throw that ball if you wanted to have a strike. But those guys had more fun with that ball for weeks. Then there was a time when there were a lot of dud shells coming in from the German side. And they always were falling in the woods around us because there was a lot of artillery around there. There were a lot of what they call gasoline dumps and ration dumps and things like that where all that stuff was piled up. I heard of a shower set up nearby. We had stuck to our area pretty much because we got almost no artillery fire there. We'd get a few shells once in a while. We call that harassing fire. They just fire a shell and then they crank the gun a couple of turns and then fire another one. They have no idea what they're shooting at or if they're hitting anything. And that's why we always felt safe in that area there. But we found when those dud shells hit, we wondered, why are they shooting so many duds? Well, after I came home and I read about these slave laborers that the Germans had, they had those working in munition factories, and they fixed those shells that they wouldn't fire. The gun would fire them, but they wouldn't explode when they landed. So we had help from a lot of people. Then too, because we had ammunition all over and gas all over and things like that, they were starting to hit those dumps at night with the artillery. So they got some bulldozers and made holes and piled all the dirt around those holes so that most of the ammunition and everything else was underground. And one night they were shelling the ammunition dumps right around us, and they kept us in our foxholes for over an hour. And the next morning we found that one from the railroad gun had landed between my foxhole and the kitchen. And that time nobody was hurt. Then, the 11th of May, the casino front began an attack. And the 23rd of May, then we were supposed to attack. So we attacked in the direction that we were going to get in behind the German troops that were retreating from the casino beachhead line. But there again, we had one general that was absolutely not going to let the British get into Rome first. He was going to have our troops go into Rome first. And General Truscott was the one that was commanding the troops that were going to cut off the Germans and get them to surrender or just kill them in a group like that. But he was outranked, and so he had to pull all of his troops back and get them all in a different direction. And if he hadn't had good discipline in his divisions, these fellows had everything figured out, what roads to take and things like that, and they got their new positions in a couple days. And then we got another break. There was a big, big hill about a mile long, and it had really no road up. It was just more like mule paths and things like that. And some of the infantry decided to go up there and see if there were any Germans up there. Well, they didn't find any. And they came back down and reported that, and then they got some bulldozers and made enough of a road up there that some tanks could get up there, and a couple of the regiments of infantry went up there. And then we could look down on the Germans and get artillery fire on them. And in a few days, they gradually were pushing the Germans back, and pretty soon it looked like we wouldn't be long, we would be in Rome. And of course, that general that wanted to be in Rome first, he always had an extra jeep along with some photographers and with newsmen and things like that, so he always got his picture in the paper, name in the paper, and things like that. And there was one newspaper man that was by himself, and he was with General Truscott in his division. And he wanted to go back and be with General Clark, who was this guy that had all the newspaper men and things along, because he wanted to be there when they entered Rome. So General Truscott said, "You stick with the 3rd Division, and you'll be in Rome first." And they had some tough fighting the next morning, and all of a sudden the Germans started to retreat. And he went in with the first tanks, and he went to all the hotels, and he signed his name in the hotel register and all the hotels to prove that he was the first newsman in Rome. And now, you may have heard this saying, Kilroy was here. That was something when troops came into a new town, there was always that Kilroy was here. They never, I don't think they ever figured out who the one was that did all of that. But it was always some of the first troops that went in, and they kept on going. But that's why he thought of that, and he just put his name in every hotel register. And a few days later, we were able to get on the outside of Rome, and because the Germans were retreating so fast, in a couple of days we were 75 miles north of Rome. And all of a sudden we got orders, turn around and go back to Rome. Another corps was going to take our place, and we were going to go someplace else again. We didn't know where. So we went back to Rome. The 3rd Division and the other divisions of 6th Corps also went back, and the 4th Corps took over where we were. And the sad thing that happened was the day we captured Rome was the day before D-Day, where they went in from England to France. And you didn't hear anything about the Italian campaign anymore after that. It was all D-Day and the troops in northern France after that.
we got time now, so we're gonna have to put an end to your story.
Okay.
Okay? Can I have the microphone for just a minute?
Yeah.
We're going to continue this, I think, next month because it's pretty interesting. And I got a question for the group now. Everybody was listening to Vern speak. Can you tell me what day he was born?
December 25th.
The Christmas Day. He was born on Christmas Day. Isn't that fantastic?
Best Christmas present my parents ever got. I'm not conceited.
A deduction, too.
Maybe the worst.
Does anybody have a question for Vern here? Because we only got a couple of minutes left here, and we like to go around again to okay. I'll hand the mic over.
Janet Miller, Hika. I'd like to know how these messages, what form were they in? Morse code or verbally, or how they came?
You can speak into the mic.
The operators all use Morse code. We had to also use Morse code because there was a lot of static, and the Germans always tried to be on the same frequency as the music station. So our operators really had tough times once in a while and we could then tell if a three-letter code was not what it's supposed to be. We could tell if they missed a dot or a dash somewhere or something like that. So we had to know Morse code too.
I was going to ask you, at one time was this over in Germany or was this in the Philippines, in the Pacific, where they had Indians speaking to each other and they could talk English, I mean their language, and the Germans couldn't figure it out, or was it
Japanese?
Japanese this was, huh? Okay, I was just wondering which one it was. I know when I was in, I heard about it and I didn't know which one it was that was the Japanese
They
one.
were all in the Pacific.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we got a gentleman here who's going to answer the question about codes. Go right ahead, please.
The Indians did not use the code, they just used their own language, even if the Americans couldn't understand them. And of course the Japanese, it drove them crazy.
Okay, very good.
Charlie Bauer, I got one more question for Vern, and then we're going to wrap it up, Vern. How do you remember all them dates? I was in service, and half the time I had no idea what day it was or where I was.
Yeah, that's right too.
I've had a diary since 1937.
Okay.
Wow.
And those 4 little lines, they brought back a lot of stuff. In fact, there were some things that were in there that I said that never happened. But I knew it happened, I had just so completely forgot about it.
Very good.
Paul's got a question back here. Frank's got a question.
Okay, we got a question pertaining to some
No,
language.
we have an answer. It
We
was
have
the Navajo language, I believe.
Oh, it was a Navajo language. Okay.
Paul, you got something?
What rank was he by now?
Oh, that's a good question.
Okay, I got a gentleman who has a question. Go right ahead, please.
Yeah, what rank were you by this time of the war?
Okay, thank you. Okay, a question on the floor pertaining to rank. Go right ahead, please.
I was a corporal when I went overseas, and I received a T3 rating, which is the same as a sergeant rating, only it's a technical rating. Then I got staff sergeant, and before the war was over in Germany, I was master sergeant.
Okay.
But that's the breaks when you get in early.
Yeah.
Because when I went overseas, I outranked all the fellows that were there. And so whenever a rating came out, I got the next rating up, and so I ended up with that.
Okay. Thank you.
I also have a question for you. I'm Kathy Sixel, and I want to know how many years were you in the service in all?
4.5 years in all, and 2.5 years overseas.
Okay.
Okay.
Wind it up, Kathy.
Okay, I want to thank Vern for the most interesting story ever, and I think we should give him a round of applause and a standing ovation. Wonderful. Thank you again, Vern. And Vern would like to continue this next month because he has a lot to tell us yet. And will all the veterans of you that were in service also bring some of your stories along and share them with us? I think that'd be very interesting. And we are going to meet August 10th again, the second Monday of the month. So that'll be it for tonight. See you next month. And Kathy Sixel.
Janet Miller.
Thank you.
Lord Bias.
Thank you.
He did an excellent job. You never think he was 92.
No, I don't.
Irene Nine.
Thank you.
Joe Kress.
Thank you.
Peg Kress.
Thank you.
Walter Kress.
Thank you, Walter.
Karen Stowe.
Thank you.
Darlene Yeager.
Thank you.
Hallsworth Yeager.
Thank you.
Dan Stoll.
Thank you.
Paul Jacoby.
Thank you, Paul.
Dan Schmidt.
Thank you, Dan.
Naomi Schmidt.
Thank you, Naomi.
Selma Local.
Thank you, Selma.
Edith Lindsay.
Thank you, Edith. That's always the hot spot there.
Audrey Erdl.
Thank you, Audrey.
Rick Byersdorf.
Thank you, Rick.
Carl Ziegler.
Thank you, Carl.
Marie Boland.
Thank you, Marie.
Frederick Jacoby.
Thank you, Fred.
Melvin Yuni.
Thank you, Melvin.
Jerry Leonard.
Thank you, Jerry.
Victor Schill.
Thank you, Victor.
Will Balance.
Thank you, Will.
John Wiegand.
Thank you, John. Oh.
I'm Charlie Bauer from Newton.
I'm Vern Wernecke from Sheboygan.
Thank you.
Next month also, Naomi has a letter from her brother, and we will put that up on the board too then. And it was in German, and she has translated it into English.
It was from prisoner of war.
From a prisoner of war that worked at the, here in Cleveland. So we'll talk about that next month too, quite interesting. Okay, everybody have a safe trip home, and again, thank you for coming.
Thank you.